In this tutorial I show you how you can animate this text animation in After Effects. I open After Effects, I create a new composition, I name it main comp. I set the width to 9020 and the height by 1080 pixels. The frame rate is 30 seconds. Then I set the background color to a white color. You can choose your own of course. I press OK. I double press here to open the project file. I select the Bounce Text Animation project file. I import it as composition retain layer sizes. I import it. And then I drag this file to the timeline. I double press here to open it. I select all the layers. I press C on my keyboard to copy this and I paste it here. Then we can delete this. And now we can start with our animation. I create a new null object. I go to layer, new null object. Then I select this tool, the pen behind, to center the anchor point in the middle of the square, and I be sure that snapping is on to place it in the middle. Then I take my white arrow and I set it on the bottom of the letter B. I select my null object and I press P for a position, and then I right click and choose separate dimensions. Now we have our separate dimensions and that's what we want. I select only the X position layer here. Then I create a new keyframe on the beginning of the timeline and 2 seconds. And I do this by pressing here the stopwatch. Then I go to 2 seconds. And I create a second keyframe like this. I zoom a little bit more in on the timeline. Then I go to the beginning of the timeline. I select the Y position here. I create again also some keyframes by pressing the stopwatch here. Then I go to 10 frames, create another keyframe. Then to 20 frames, another keyframe. Then to 10 frames, another keyframe, and to 2 seconds. I move it a little bit further here and then I select the Y position and I create another keyframe. I made a little mistake here by 10 frames on the beginning of the timeline. I need to delete this like this. So now we have all our keyframes. I select here on the X position the first keyframe and I drag the null object outside of the canvas on the right like this. Then I create here another keyframe and I move it up a little like this. I go to 1 second and what I do is I copied the second keyframe by Ctrl C. I go to 1 second on the timeline like this and I do Ctrl V to paste it, and also on 20 frames. And now we have a bouncy effect already. And now I select all the keyframes on the Y position and I press F9 on my keyboard to create a smoother transition. Then I go to the graph editor and we see this. I select this one and I create a smoother transition. You need to do the same as me. Then I go to my timeline again. Then I go to my last keyframes here. Be sure that you are on the last keyframes. Here on 2 seconds. Then I close this of the null object. I go to my B layer and I parent this to the null object. So if you can see this thing, you need to right click, columns, parent and link. So now we have linked our B layer to the null object. And if you can see, it is a bounce effect. I go back to my null object and I press U to see the keyframes. And I select the keyframe on the beginning of the timeline by the X position and I drag it a little bit more outside of the canvas so that we don't see the letter anymore. And now I will play it. It's a little bit too slow, so I select all the keyframes. I press Alt on my keyboard and I hold it while I drag these to each other. Now it's too quick, so I do the same, press Alt on my keyboard while I drag this. And now I will check it. Yes, that looks good. Then I select the B layer and I press R on my keyboard to open rotation. Then I add a keyframe on the beginning of the timeline to press the stopwatch here. Then I go here to the third keyframe. From this one, I will zoom a little bit in. So I go to the third keyframe from the Y position. I create a new keyframe and I set it to 1. Then I go to the fifth keyframe and I set this to 0. Then I go to my last keyframe here and I set this to -1. And now you can see it rotates. That looks very good. Then I select all the keyframes here. I press F9 to create a smoother transition, if you can see. And then I press here toggle switches modes and I go to my B layer here and I be sure that I select this option to create a motion blur to make it realistic. Then I go to my null object here and I press S on my keyboard to go to scale. Then I check this out and I go to my last keyframe of the rotation. Then I create a keyframe by pressing the stopwatch. I go one frame further. I create another one. We zoom a little bit in to see it better. So I create another keyframe. I go back to my middle one here. And I go one frame further on the timeline. And I make another keyframe. And now, if you can see, if we zoom a little bit in, we have 3 keyframes. Then I go to the middle keyframe, I select this one and I set the first one to 100% and the other one to 70. Then I go to my last keyframe here, I select this one, I set this to 110 and I go 2 frames further on the timeline and I set it back to 100. So what I do is I select the first 3 keyframes here. I copy this, copy by Ctrl C. I go to here, the second keyframe on the timeline. I press V and I be sure, I zoom a little bit in to see it better and I set the middle one the same by this keyframe, if that makes sense. And I will do this the same for all the keyframes here, dus Ctrl V and I center this with the middle one. That looks very good. Then I go here to my last keyframe and I want to add a ruler. I do this by View, Show Rulers, and I add a ruler on the bottom of the letter B. I zoom a little bit in. Now I will close everything to add a better view. So I close everything. I go to my last keyframe and then I press P on my keyboard to go to position. And I will move it to the left and I be sure that it is in the center of the letter B. And I do this with all the layers, so press P and adding it to the center of all the letters. So now we need to duplicate the null object a few times for every layer. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 letters, so we need to duplicate the null object 5 times. And I do this by Ctrl D. And I select this one, I press enter and I name it B, the other one O, U, N, C and E. So we have parent this letter B already to the B null object. So now we need to do this for every letter. So I add this symbol again. I go to the O letter null object and I do this for every letter. So every letter is now linked with a null object. Then I select the letter B, I press R on my keyboard and I select all the keyframes. I press Ctrl C to duplicate this. I go to the beginning of the timeline and now I select the O layer. I press R on my keyboard. I press Ctrl V to paste it and I do this for every single layer. And now it moves with each other, but it rotates, so that's good. And now I add motion blur to every layer. So I do this by selecting this symbol on every layer to create a realistic look. Now what I'm gonna do is I pre-compose every letter layers. So I select both B layers, I press right click, pre-compose, and I name it B. And I be sure that I select the second option here and I press OK. And I do this for every letter layers. Now we have this, and it is still the same. That's okay. And now I zoom out here to see everything. So now I go to my 2 seconds, so the last keyframe, to see it, and I select the O. I press P on my keyboard for position and I will drag this a little bit further on green, and I do the same. I select the U layer, press P on my keyboard and change also this position. And also for the last letter. And normally it goes like this. And this looks very good. What we now can do is we can set the timing for each letter a little bit different so that it comes differently in the canvas, if that makes sense. So what I do is I select the O layer and I set it 2 frames further on the timeline, and I do this too with the other layers. I'm going to make it a little bit further, so 4 frames further. Let's see. Yes, that looks really good. So this is our text animation. I hope you like this video. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. It's totally free. And you can watch also my other tutorials about logo animation and text animation on my YouTube channel. And then I hope I see you in the next tutorial. Thanks for watching.